Hello and a warm Collisions YYC. Welcome to my guest this morning, Mr. Dave Bradley. How you doing, Dave?
Great. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, man. I'm excited. This is a topic. I haven't had anyone on the show to talk about this as of late, but we're going to talk about, I'm going to say Bitcoin, but that's maybe being too specific, but we can unpack that. I've heard you affectionately been referred to through a mutual friend as you got to meet Bitcoin Dave. So at the lack of any other introduction role or title, I think we'll lead in with welcome to the show, Bitcoin Dave. Let the audience in. Who are you? What do you do? Clearly Bitcoin blows your hair back and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm in a lot of people's phones as Bitcoin Dave. I've been in Bitcoin since 2010, and I've been working full-time in the industry since 2013.
Nice.
And I've now achieved the illustrious title whereby I'm widely known as the strongest and best-looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada.
Okay. How do you earn said title? Because I did see it on your LinkedIn, and I thought I'd let you present that rather than intro.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a story. We had a store that we opened up in 2013 down by Chicken on the Way in Kensington.
Yeah.
And we called ourselves the fastest and safest place to buy Bitcoin in Canada.
Okay.
And then some years later, we realized that a bunch of people had copied that, and we changed our tagline. And then a year later, people had copied that one. And I made the joke that we should just call ourselves something they won't copy, like strongest and best looking. We didn't do anything about it at that point. But then a couple of years later, there was a bunch of scandals in our industry. We had a big exchange go down. Another one got caught wash trading on their own exchange. And the Ontario Securities Commission came out with some guidance that said that if you're an executive at a Bitcoin exchange, you're not allowed to make superlative marketing claims unless they're demonstrably true. And I was like, okay, bring it. Like,
challenge accepted.
Yeah, let's see if the government sues me over this claim. And so the fact that they haven't sued me basically means that they've endorsed me.
Fair. Okay, because if they did, that also would. There's no such thing as bad publicity, right? In that case, you would have won either way on that one. You know, as a marketer, I do like that, and I figured there was a story behind it. I wouldn't have guessed that that's what it was.
Yeah.
So, hey. Nobody's living in a bubble anymore. We've heard about crypto. We've heard about Bitcoin. But 2010, 2013, and you mentioned there's been, exchanges go down. There's been lots of controversy. There's been lots of noise in your industry. So rather than going a little bit history of what got us to now, where are we now? It's 2025. God knows what's happened. I haven't looked at my news feed for the last 5 minutes, so the world could have changed as we know it, as we're recording here, the middle of April. So who knows what our friends south of the border, and we're a week away at this point from a Canadian election. So where is crypto and maybe Bitcoin specifically in the world where it sits now, let alone we could talk for 3 hours on what maybe got us here.
Yeah, it's very different than it was back then. When I got into Bitcoin, it was mostly marketed as like a payment tool, like a competitor to Visa or PayPal. And, there wasn't a lot of clarity on what the actual innovations happening here really were. And it wasn't until some years later that, I and a bunch of other people started to realize that the real problem that Bitcoin is solving is money printing. It's not payment processing. Our current banking system, whether it's, you tap your phone or whatever, it does a really good job of processing payments. But what the current system doesn't do a good job at is storing value. And so what money is supposed to do is take the value that you create with your time and store it to use it later. And the problem with doing that with dollars is that while you're storing the money, while you're holding the dollars, the government's printing more of them. And so the ones that you hold are becoming less rare and therefore less valuable. And Bitcoin's better because the government can't print more of them, basically.
This is controlled. That's when I watched one of your videos this morning. I think it was Diablo 2, where you talked about in-game money way back. And the reality is, the more rare or scarce something is, the better of a system it is for storing value versus something that can just be a certain group of elites, just the way you worded it, and I think it's very accurate, can just decide on a whim that they're going to print more. So then, therefore, your bag of magic beans just got worth less, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as you mentioned, nobody's living in a bubble now. We're in this super connected world, and I think the upside to what we all went through with COVID was that a huge percentage of people have been awoken to what the problem actually is. And the problem that Bitcoin ultimately, I believe, will solve is not just the power of money printing, but what they do with that money. And so right now we've got this group, the government, who is really just a parasitic organization that has long since stopped acting in the interests of the people, and they're printing an virtually unlimited amount of money to spend on their own pet projects and basically to shore up their power and stay in power. And so I think that those interests of those who print the money and spend it, and the interests of those who the value behind the money belong to, have diverged so significantly that a very large chunk of people have woken up at this point, and that's why I think we're seeing such large support. Even though there isn't really much of a movement, we're starting to see significant support in Alberta for separation, and we're starting to see a lot more people questioning: is this a good deal? This deal that we have with the federal government and the various layers of government, and like I say, the elite class that is allowed to print money because of their special powers and reallocate those resources wherever they deem fit.
Well, Dave, you just unfurled like 17 different rabbit holes we could go down with that statement. So maybe let's pick a piece to talk about. The counterculture aspect that I think I was exposed to earlier on in Bitcoin, when this was more of a, hey, these are the people on the fringe that don't want to fall into the system. They want to do things over here. I agree with you, or maybe I'm agreeing with what I think I heard, as that started to become a little bit more of a mainstream reality that I think COVID triggered. So if we think about Bitcoin as this storing of value versus, no, I want to stay away from the system. Talk to me about just how that shifted. Was it COVID? Was that the catalyst when more people were at home with time to spare and interest and energy, and seeing maybe what happens when people holding the wheel don't go in the direction that everyone else, that the mass actually wanted to go in?
Yeah, I mean, COVID was a big catalyst for it. There were really two factors going on there. One is, what we saw with COVID was that the government used the power that they have from the money that they've printed against us, right? And so a lot of people felt like we were overly cracked down upon during COVID, that the measures were too harsh, that they didn't make any sense. And I think that woke up a lot of people. But I think the even bigger thing is just the power of inflation. And, if you would have gone to a random person on the street in 2018 or 2019 and talked to them about inflation, they probably would have heard about it. But it would have been, for most people, this kind of nebulous thing that, maybe they saw on the news, and it's like, well, the government says it's 3% and they say it's supposed to be 2%. So sounds like we're all good. But we've now gotten to this point where the real inflation, because of the sheer scope of the money printing that they've inflicted upon the economy, has vastly exceeded those official numbers. And I think most people can feel that because it hits us in the grocery bill, right? You go to the store and your steak is triple what it was 6 years ago. And that has really thrust itself into a lot more people's lives, and it's something that is almost impossible to ignore unless you're basically rich enough not to care what your groceries cost. And
but that is not the large portion of, and we're just talking about Canadians. Like globally, there's, we'll talk about Canadians for right now, and even North American. That is a phenomenon that is kind of happening everywhere. Canada certainly seems to be hit by it fairly strong. And let's be honest, there's a very small portion of people that I think don't care about their grocery bill.
Yeah.
And a lot of people I know with money have money because they care about their grocery bill, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. You have money by focusing on it and understanding what creates value. But again, if you look at that globally, inflation wasn't a North American or wasn't a Canadian phenomenon. So are we also looking at government, the quintessential institution that starts to protect itself, not the people it was originally intended to protect? This is a bigger phenomenon than just Canada, or certainly North America, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of a fundamental shift in what I believe will be taking place about the relationship between the individual and the state.
Okay.
And, if you were to go back 1,000 years, the individual needed the state a lot more for our protection of physical safety and our property rights. And now the world has changed in such a way that we don't need quite as many resources spent on the application of violence to keep us safe. We live in a society where pretty minimal enforcement can keep us physically safe. And, we're not even getting that minimal enforcement in most of our cities these days. But I believe that relationship has shifted, and like I mentioned, to one that is essentially parasitic. And these government programs have ballooned to such an extent that, nobody really knows what they are. You see these lists coming out of the US of the Government Efficiency Office and the stuff that's been leaking in Canada about these absurd places that they're spending all of our tax dollars and our dollars that they've printed. And those are so profoundly disconnected from the the interests of the average Canadian that it's becoming a lot harder for really everyone to ignore. And these days, I think we're going to see a huge split in this election. This will probably be over. The election will be over by the time this airs.
The future's already happened by the time we're airing this episode.
But maybe I'll look really smart by saying that the boomers are going to vote for the Liberals and the young people are going to vote for the Conservatives, because the only people who have an interest in things staying the way that they are basically the rich old people who are coasting on the fumes of this money printing fueled largesse that the federal government has created.
Who just to be clear, because I'm not as young as I once was, who are the rich old people? How would you classify that? What group does that look like?
Well, you know what? I feel like it's and I'm not the youngest either. I don't feel like I fit into that group yet. I feel like we're literally talking about the boomers. We're talking about 65, 70 plus people who really don't have as much of a vested interest in the future as young people do. And
just by a sheer function of time.
Yeah, exactly. There's the saying that a society prospers when old men plant trees that they will never sit in the shade of.
Yes.
And
I've heard that.
We're really not in that kind of a scenario right now. We're in a scenario where the governments of the world, this is not a unique North American phenomenon, have been leveraging the future for current prosperity and current growth.
Oh, that's the finite versus infinite. If you want to get into what length of game are we playing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so the idea that they can just grow forever, and they've got these magic levers that they can use to control the entire economy by moving interest rates up or down, is one that has been profoundly disproven, right? And all of the resources that have been spent over the last, especially 50 years. That's when the scope of government has really cranked up. All of those resources that have been spent have to be paid for. And we're just coming up to the point where now, we're paying for it. And where we're paying for it is the value of our purchasing power is being siphoned away. And that's why we're feeling that inflation, is because that value that is supposed to be attached to our dollars has already been spent.
Interesting. And we're paying for it. So when you put cryptocurrencies in the middle of that, obviously you've got government attempts at government regulation. But talk to me about how that balances out, because you're right. This is if this narrative over here is as per the way you laid it out, and then all of a sudden you've introduced something now that plays outside of the rules of your traditional monetary, it doesn't function the same way. And you've seen so much fear, and do we regulate it? Do we not? US, when Trump came in, there was a big boost in the kind of value from a crypto, crypto value perspective. And then that seems to have come back down. Where's that balance out between us and them? So dangerous when you start talking that way. When the government bodies start really trying to enforce regulation on something that inherently kind of breaks the mold of the system that they're playing in with the levers, and here's the rules of gravity over here, and the rules of gravity over here are different.
Yeah. I gotta answer two things about this one. One is that surprisingly, the government regulations have been somewhat reasonable. They could have been much more stifling for our industry than they are. They're still annoying. They're still largely pointless, and they spend a lot of time and money doing things that don't really accomplish anything. But that's pretty much what they do.
You just described what you were describing. You just kind of summed it up right there, didn't you?
and that's not unique to our industry either. There's almost no industry that you can enter where you won't very quickly run into a government roadblock for whatever you're trying to build, whether you need a permit or a license.
I think any kind of development road path in Canada in the last 10 years has been rife with exactly that, right?
Yeah. And so if the governments of the world really understood the implications of Bitcoin, they would be trying to ban it. They would have been trying to ban it from the very start. But I think it's come too far at this point where, it's too big, and it's also a competitive thing between countries right now. And that's what you saw with Trump, where, a lot of Asian countries, places in the Caribbean were openly embracing the industry and saying, yes, we want these businesses here. And it was becoming an economic drain on the United States because good businesses were having to leave because of this overregulation. And so they've actually, I think, swung too far in the opposite direction, where they're allowing a whole bunch of scams, including Trump's own coin, to be
I heard that that's just a legal way if you want to slip him a brown envelope of cash, literally.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
but that brings me to the second part of the answer that I was wanting to get to is that, you mentioned cryptocurrency, and that's something that has often been bundled in with Bitcoin. But
Yep.
I think it's very important to make the separation between those two things,
Okay.
because, I've been in the space a long time. Like you mentioned, I was very involved in the blockchain consortium, so I was big proponent of blockchain technology for a long time. And really, it's come to the point where it's quite clear that there are no other uses of blockchain technology that have been found to be useful. And so,
Oh, interesting. Okay. Because it's
everything
kind
that's-
of, I haven't, it's just kind of, it sounded like one of those things when you first get exposed to, you're like, oh, this is going to be so good for so many things. And then you just don't hear about it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Everything that's crypto or blockchain that is not Bitcoin at this point should be viewed as at worst a scam and at best a bad idea.
Oh, okay.
And that's been quite proven out by, many years, decades at this point of development and attempts to build things. And we've got, kind of the two big paths where you've got the crypto stuff like Ethereum and, nothing has been built on Ethereum except for platforms to gamble on other kinds of crypto, essentially. And we're 9 years in. So there's not even a single working app that isn't a gambling app. And on the flip side, you've got sort of like the blockchain technology, like the industrial blockchain side. And it's kind of the same thing. Like my theory was that because a blockchain is really just a database. It's not functionally any different than a database. And in most cases, pretty much all cases, you'd be better off to run a database. And everything that can be accomplished with a blockchain can be accomplished with a database as well. But my theory was that maybe the fact that it was a buzzword would sort of like trick companies into upgrading their database, and that you would have objectively better databases, even though they were blockchains.
Okay. Yeah.
Because people would move on it. But that just hasn't been the case. We're, again, it was about 2016, 2017 when blockchain started becoming a big buzzword. And I don't think there's a single instance of an industrial blockchain that's replaced a database in a high-level production environment in any company anywhere in the world. And so it's kind of an idea whose time
I've kind of
has run
seen it
its
fade
course.
away, but didn't really know the why or the what behind it.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of buzzwords, they get big, they get pumped up. People use it to raise money. People use it to promote their next product, and they ultimately flame out. But that's that's capitalism. That's how we vet ideas, and so I think those ideas at this point have been vetted.
So interesting. So then when you've got, I appreciate the separation of the two. And that was one of my things as I was just getting prepped for this call. I was like, okay, very clear. It wasn't crypto Dave, it was Bitcoin Dave. So I really wanted to get clarity on those two things. And it's interesting. Of course, I've seen by lack of presence in my feeds, even the term blockchain kind of go away, but I hadn't heard it as black and white as you just put it. So if you go back to Bitcoin and you think about it as a store of value hedging against the inflationary and kind of the devaluation of money, how does that use case unfold? Is it simply just more people getting it and parking it and sitting on it than not? How does that then contribute to actively moving our economy forward? Back to your point about capitalism. If Bitcoin's not coming into play as money would, or as capital would, or being used as capital to move projects forward, how does that fit into that larger economics picture?
Yeah, so there's a couple elements to money. Like I mentioned, the first one is that store of value, and that's the bare minimum. If your money doesn't store value, it's not really money anymore. And beyond that, what it needs to become is a medium of exchange and then a unit of account in that order. And so right now, Bitcoin is just kind of undergoing the transition from being just a store of value where people would park their money there as a way to avoid inflation. A lot of people look at it as an investment, even though it's more like a savings tool. But people park money in Bitcoin, their purchasing power goes up, and they're happy. Right now, what we're seeing a lot of is people are starting to use it for commerce. And so we've got, for example, an initiative that we run here out of Calgary. We do it a couple times a year called the SAT market. A SAT or a Satoshi is the smallest unit of Bitcoin, many fractions of a cent. And we run this, we're going to be running the next one, I believe, on June 27th, right before our conference coming into the summer here. And basically, it's kind of like a flea market, farmer's market, where everyone takes Bitcoin. And this came out of a good friend of mine, Ben Perrin, very successful Bitcoin YouTuber, also local to Calgary here, goes by BTC Sessions. Okay. And
I think I've watched some of those a while back. I haven't watched any recently.
Yeah, he has tutorials on literally everything Bitcoin related. So if you want to get started,
I was getting into
Bitcoin,
it and learning. I spent some time on his channel. Yeah,
by far the best place to start. And Yeah, when we were getting cracked down upon by the government during COVID and we were having a lot of our basic freedoms taken away, he started to worry specifically about his food supply. And so he was like, how can I buy beef without the government's help or permission? Because the worry with the way the world was going, especially at that time, was that this whole climate cult was going to overtake our politics as well, and that we'd be ending up with restrictions on our lifestyles based on climate choices as well. You know, similar to the sort of social credit score
not being
stuff
allowed
that you
to buy
see in
beef
China.
kind of scenario that was happening.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, like you can only drive so far today because you bought too much red meat last week, and those kind of restrictions are quite scary for people who you know, make meat a big part of their diet. And so
Yep.
he was like, how can I buy beef with Bitcoin? And started seeking out vendors. And then it kind of snowballed into this thing of like, how do we get everything else that we want and need for Bitcoin? And so we started up these markets, and we've got different vendors selling all kinds of different stuff. And it's created a really nice community. And frankly, the vendors probably spend more money at each other's businesses than anybody else does, but it's created this essentially like a circular economy where like I say, we're transacting.
It's almost
without
now
the
you're getting
government's-
back to the barter economy where, well, you
Yeah.
do this and you do that. That's your skill set in the village, and then we barter and your value is there.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back to where we came from, just using technology as a layer.
Yeah, it's a lot like a barter economy, but the whole point of one of the points of having money instead of a barter economy is to solve what's called the coincidence of wants.
Yep.
So you got one guy who's a fisherman and one guy who builds homes. The fisherman is never going to have enough fish to buy a home, right?
Yeah.
And so you need
I need
some kind of
fish
technology.
every day, but I only need one home. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. You never have. You need this technology in between to translate the value from the fish to the home, and that's what money solves on top of.
Well, back to your store of value comment from earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
It's your battery bank, if you will. Interesting. And how many vendors would typically be at an event like that? Like, what does that look like? Of course, I'm picturing myself walking into the farmer's market on a Saturday morning. Does it feel and look just like that?
It's a lot like that. It's smaller than the farmer's market. I think we probably had about 50 vendors out for our Christmas one.
That's still a pretty good. That's a good number, man.
Yeah, it was a good showing for sure. And
what's the most interesting thing I could get there? And interesting is subjective, so you can answer that any way you want.
I mean, I bought a half a pig. That was pretty interesting.
Okay.
But yeah, there's
I'm
all
also
kinds
a meat
of stuff.
enthusiast, so I think you and I could go shopping together. Would be good.
Yeah, tarot cards, lots of art, children's books, different kind of clothing,
a little bit of the Etsy community, a little bit kind of.
Yeah,
that way.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's pretty similar in terms of the kind of vendors that you would see at the farmers market, and so but it also tends to select for people that are kind of a little bit more freedom minded, who are looking for some community, looking for a place that they fit, and it's been a really great experience seeing that community grow. So it's a pretty cool thing, and I would definitely
that's fun. I like that.
Definitely love to invite people out. And
you said that's right before your event. What you said we talked offline. What's your event and when's it coming up? I'm all about blatant plugs for upcoming things.
Yeah, so we've got a conference that we put on. This is now the fourth one. Nice. It's called the Bitcoin Rodeo. It's not an actual rodeo, but it's just a Bitcoin conference that we do in downtown Calgary. It is going to be June 28th and 29th. You can get tickets at bitcoinrodeo.com, and it's a conference that's geared to people who are interested in Bitcoin at all levels. So it's not a technical conference. It's not going to be super nerdy or super deep down in the weeds on the economic side of things. Mm-hmm. We're aiming to make it something that is useful for people who are beginners as well as seasoned Bitcoin people. And there's a pretty heavy focus on the networking and community side as well. We want to drive that as much as we can, because I think those kind of people meeting each other in Alberta is going to have a pretty big impact in the near future here with depending, I guess, especially the way this election goes. I think we need those kind of communities.
That perceived technological barrier that's often been there with Bitcoin and crypto, speaking broadly, but I appreciate your clarification of the two. We'll talk about Bitcoin. Has that kind of gone down? Is the technology now approachable? And obviously there's so many more opportunities for people to purchase Bitcoin in different ways to do it. There's obviously hasn't been any recent controversies, but not that long ago, there was, either FTX, we can all point to the ones that make the media. Are you finding that person who's like really curious, but new to the space? Is it just a lot easier for them to get involved than it was I was going to say 10 years ago, but maybe even 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's definitely easier. There's a bunch of products that have made it easier, from wallets and different devices that make it pretty simple to get involved.
Yeah.
It is a little different because it kind of steps us outside of our comfort zone in the way that we use a lot of products these days. It's actually not any more difficult than going into the bank and setting up a bank account. Probably takes about an hour of your time to learn, what you need to know to get set up.
Yeah.
But there's this saying that we have in our industry, be your own bank. And
I've heard that. Yeah.
That can be very useful, but it also comes with a lot of responsibilities, right? And so if you're going to be your own bank, you got to make sure that your bank doesn't get robbed. You got to make sure that your money in your bank doesn't get lost. And so there's a little bit of stuff that you need to be deliberate with in terms of setting up your Bitcoin wallets. And it needs your brain power. It needs your attention in a way that most things don't. You set up your Netflix account, you punch in your credit card, you don't have to really think about it. That's how most things are these days. It's designed for us not to have to think.
Well, they're designed to remove as much friction from the consumer purchase as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you've got some friction baked in that is tied to autonomy and taking control and be your own bank. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it just requires some brain power and a little bit of thought and a little bit of your undivided attention. And that's something that is sometimes hard to get from people these days. But
what my Instagram? What? Yeah,
exactly. And so, but I think it's well worth it, and we've seen that based on the outcomes for everybody who's ever bought Bitcoin and then waited 5 years has been massively up in terms of spending power measured in dollars. And unless the government stops printing money, that ratio between how rare Bitcoin is and how rare dollars are is just going to continue to go up.
I think that the addiction of printing money is not going to get cured. No one's going to rehab anytime soon. You know what I mean? Like they're addicted to that. Hey, you said store of value earlier. You said medium of exchange, and then you had a third one. What was the third one? And I didn't write it down. I missed it.
The third one is a unit of account.
Okay.
And that one is kind of like the final step of money. That one probably won't show up at large scale until the dollar is basically dead. And that's basically a unit of account is when you price things in Bitcoin. So,
okay.
Right now, if I were to take something that I wanted to sell to the SAT market and put it up for sale, I probably bought it for dollars, or I made it using inputs that were priced in dollars.
Yep.
And so for me to price it in Bitcoin would be kind of a disconnect, right? Because the price of Bitcoin can fluctuate compared to the dollars, and I might end up with a product that's either too expensive or too cheap. And so I think that's going to be kind of like the last step. And to make a big statement, I do believe that in our lifetimes, we will see the death of the dollar. We will see the Canadian dollar go to zero in terms of purchasing power. We will see the United States dollar go to zero. And at that point, money naturally emerges. Money has been a force that has, in every civilization in the world, people have invented money. Mm-hmm. And people naturally choose the best form of money. And I believe, obviously, that Bitcoin is the best form of money. And I do believe that Bitcoin will be the one replacing all of these things, but that will be up to the market.
With the fact that there is a limited, how many Bitcoin is there? 20, 21, 22? What's the number?
Yeah, there will eventually be 21 million.
That's
right now, there's about 19.5 million out there.
And some are lost, and some are, again, out of that, I've read different things over time. And so, but thinking about the fact that it is finite, and I guess then as it gets distributed, or as more people start to use it for a store of value and a medium of exchange, then you really just get into market forces of what it's worth, what it's not worth, how much is in circulation, but the circulation is set. So that's an interesting concept when you build that out over time, as we're thinking more people accumulating it, more people stockpiling it, but then they have to use it because it's a medium of exchange. It's interesting you think about that, how it regulates, because we've just got so used to our own current model of we'll just print more of it. It's such a different,
exactly.
It's a bit of a mind fuck a little bit to think about it that way, right?
Yeah, it's entirely unique. And you mentioned earlier using it as capital. And I believe that we're entering an era where it's going to be used a lot more as capital. It's going to be a really good collateral. because it's the most liquid form of capital out there. And it's entirely unique, as you mentioned, in the fact that you've got the supply and demand going on. But Bitcoin's the only thing in the world, basically, where the supply can't respond to the demand, right? So you can take something like gold, which is a very good form of money. And if the price of gold goes to $10,000 an ounce, then all of a sudden there are going to be a lot more gold mines that are viable.
Yeah.
And so the market will respond, they'll produce more gold, and the supply of gold will go up. But with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter what happens to the price. The number of new Bitcoins that can be created is set in stone forever. And so no one can actually change that and just mine more Bitcoin. And so for that reason, it's just math. It's supply and demand. And if the supply is fixed and the demand goes up, then what do you think will happen?
Yes. My basic economics, grade 6 economics can figure it out. So if I look at right now, if I go on good old my coin market and I look at obviously the last few days, there's been, things in specifically Bitcoin has gone up, but so has the price of gold. Are they tracking similar right now in this obviously inflationary environment and devaluation of money? Are we seeing gold and Bitcoin more linked than Bitcoin and we'll just pick USD?
Yeah, I mean, we're in an interesting spot. We're obviously in a time of pretty big economic upheaval and turmoil in the world with all the tariffs and the trade wars and crazy changes.
That's putting it mildly, Dave.
Yeah, and what we've seen mostly, gold I think has largely been suppressed because most of the market for gold is paper. It's fake. And they were saying they're going to go check on Fort Knox and see if the gold is there. And then we didn't hear anything about that. So,
yes, the paper proxy of the real of the physical good.
Yeah. And so they may have sold way more paper than the physical actually exists, and that can keep the price quite down.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And that can happen with Bitcoin too. We've got these Bitcoin ETFs where they basically hold Bitcoin for you and sell you a paper version of it. But the difference is that it's much easier to verify Bitcoin holdings than it is to verify gold holdings, right? If somebody's holding 1 million Bitcoins for their ETF, they can prove it for free in about 5 seconds, whereas auditing Fort Knox would be like $1 billion process to test all that.
Literally,
gold, right?
It sounds as hard as the words auditing Fort Knox. Like you know what I mean? Just as what Fort Knox means as even a metaphor, let alone an actual physical place.
And so I think what's going on with gold is that it's starting to, people are starting to realize this. And so there's a premium in lots of parts of the world on physical gold.
Yeah.
And people are buying up, especially China, they're buying up mass amounts of physical gold. And so that's driving the gold price. I think the price of Bitcoin has only recently become untethered somewhat from the stock market.
Yeah.
Because what we've mostly seen up until now is that Bitcoin has been, like I said earlier, it's been kind of like a speculative investment for a lot of people. It's been essentially a risk-on investment. So it's been something that people invest in when the market's going up, when there's a lot of liquidity in the market. It's been something that people are jumping into with the hope of selling later for a few more dollars, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's run quite counter to what we in the Bitcoin industry have always believed that it should be, which is a hedge to all of this money printing, a hedge to all this insanity in the global stock markets and the global economy. And I think we're just starting to see only very recently that decoupling where the stock market's going one direction, Bitcoin's going the other direction.
Yeah.
Because up until really this year, it's always sort of flown with the stock market. Mm-hmm. And so we'll see, if it keeps going in that direction, it's setting itself up to really establish itself as a hedge to all of that insanity. And that's what really the market should be viewing it as.
It's interesting when you talk about, I bought it now, it goes up, I sell it later. I'm just treating it like the things I already understand, right? It's acting and it looks like the things I've already done. I bought this, buy low, sell high. We've all watched the movies. That looks a lot like that. I guess maybe it isn't a scam. Well, I'll put a couple % of my portfolio in there, or I'll play around. But to your point, that gets you more comfortable. That gets it less scary. That makes it feel like, oh, that kind of worked. That wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe there's other things going on. So it kind of felt like that was a necessary stage.
Yeah, definitely. And I think most people get into Bitcoin hoping to just make some more dollars. That was how I got into it as well. And
because that's what we've all been programmed. That's the bill of goods we've been sold over the years, right?
Yeah, it feels a lot like an investment. It feels like logging into a Bitcoin exchange and buying some Bitcoin. Feels a lot like logging into your E-Trade or whatever and buying some Netflix stock.
Yeah.
But the difference is when you buy Bitcoin, you don't get any rights. You don't have ownership over anything. You don't get any kind of income from that, and there's no yield of any kind. And so all you're buying is that consensus among the users of Bitcoin about who holds which Bitcoin. That's really all it is. Is money is a shared consensus, and we've found a way. That shared consensus through most of history has come from the government. They've imposed the consensus on us, and now we've found a way to reach that consensus and agree on who has what money without their help.
So what's the fear of all of a sudden, you said the government in certain areas could be more regulatory, or they maybe are being a little bit more lenient when you think about the dichotomy of kind of the way you're presenting it, which I've heard many people talk about that. And certainly these troubled days we live in, it seems to be pointing more and more in that direction as we go, oh my goodness, who's got their hand on the wheel of this thing over here? I'm assuming you, as someone who's been in this industry for years and seen lots of highs and lows and over government involvement and then maybe a lack of, what's your greatest fear when you look at the future of governments going, oh shit, we're losing control of the asylum here. We need to implement some more rules.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. If they knew what they were up against, they probably would have tried to ban it a long time ago. But one problem with that idea is that all governments are very bad at everything. And so, how did it go?
No argument, Dave.
How did it go when they tried to ban cocaine? Yeah. Right? It didn't work, and it's a lot easier to move Bitcoin than it is to move cocaine. And so,
fair.
Realistically, governments could crack down on it, and they could hurt my businesses. They could hurt the businesses that are legal businesses that sell Bitcoin to people who want it in a voluntary transaction, but they couldn't actually ban Bitcoin. And if they tried, it would probably actually drive the price way up. Yeah. Just like it did with cocaine. And so
it's an interesting comparison you chose.
Yeah. But I don't see that being a very big risk. But I think in the future, a risk that is almost a certainty is that the governments will at some point confiscate all of the Bitcoin that they can, right? Because they're kind of in a race to the bottom right now, where they're like, we have to print money. We have to use our monetary policy to make up for the fact that we have this absurd, unhinged fiscal policy. We're spending money at a greater extent than at any point in human history. We're spending so much more money than we have, let alone we're spending more money than there is. And so they're having to create more money in order to continue this spending. And we've seen this time and time again in different places throughout the world where when a government prints too much money, eventually they reach a tipping point and they go off the cliff. And we've seen that in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Lebanon, Argentina, many examples throughout history where hyperinflation has hit and people have essentially lost all faith in their money. And in those scenarios, inevitably a new form of money emerges and ends up being used by the people. So in Venezuela, when their currency was collapsing, most people were trying to use US dollars. People were even using iTunes gift cards because they're denominated in US dollars as their currency in Venezuela. And I think someday we'll see a scenario much like that with our dollar, with the American dollar, where, they've just simply printed too many of them and people are starting to say, I don't want this, because if you have to accept those kind of overprinted dollars, right now we're in a situation where if you're holding dollars, you're probably losing about a quarter of the value per year. That's my guess on actual inflation rates is about 20 to 25%. But when you get to a point where, it's hundreds of thousands of percent per year, you have to spend your money today because it's going to be worth half as much tomorrow.
Yeah, because your net present value of money is actually declining at a way greater rate than kind of standard.
Yeah. And so when we get to that point, and governments have gotten to that point, that was the situation that the world was nearly in right after World War I, where the money was linked to gold and the gold was all gone. And so it was like, what do we do? And the United States government did what was called Executive Order 6102. And that was an order where they made it illegal for an average citizen to own gold, and they repegged the value of gold to the value of the dollar. And so, and because gold is very difficult to store, it's very difficult to transport at scale, a huge percentage of all the gold that was out there was sitting in these big bank vaults. And so the government was able to very easily confiscate that gold sitting in bank vaults and essentially issue IOUs, dollars, to cover that. And I think it's kind of an inevitability that at some point, unless, like I mentioned before, unless somehow sanity prevails and governments stop spending at such an insane level, at some point they're going to need to start confiscating more resources, because the dollars that they print will no longer be able to fund the spending levels that they're at. And so Bitcoin stored in large exchanges, Bitcoin stored in, like I mentioned, these ETFs and the large regulated custodians will be very, very easy for them to confiscate at some point. And I view this as a near certainty. It's just a matter of when. I have no idea when. It might be next week, or it might be 20 years from now.
So with that said, good hygiene on my Bitcoin now goes right back to be your own bank, get it into your own wallet, get it off. Don't play in those more. I know it feels like an institutional approach that you're comfortable with because of the way you've invested before, the way you've held your funds, your mutual funds, or ETFs, or even your individual equities. What I'm hearing, if I'm going to read between the lines, is taking that degree of personal ownership and accountability is kind of mission critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to like what I was saying about, you need to spend an hour on it. Check out BTC Sessions. He's got all the startup guides on YouTube.
Nice.
And, if I'm going to offer another shameless plug, we've got two companies that I'm involved in. Bull Bitcoin and Bitcoin Well are two of the best places in Canada to buy Bitcoin. And very importantly, in both of those cases, the company never holds your Bitcoin.
So you need a wallet, which I think terminology, most people listening, like all we've heard. Obviously that is, you buy it, you quote unquote download it onto your wallet, and then you take that offline, air gap it, put it in your vault, put it in your safe, put it somewhere. But then that's literally like your physical, it's that feeling of like, I've got $100 in my wallet. But in this case, that 100 Bitcoins, or maybe that'd be a good hefty wallet. Let's just say one Bitcoin is still going to be worth what it is, or more a year from now, where that $100 in my wallet might be worth considerably less in terms of what I can buy with it. I can only get 2 stakes instead of 4.
Yeah. So there's a couple details in there. So you can get a wallet on your phone. You can get a wallet on your computer.
Okay. Are those secure?
Well, they're as secure as the phone or the computer are. Right. And so
these days that doesn't feel very secure.
They might not be that secure. Okay. You can get a standalone device, but whether or not it's worth it to get a standalone device kind of depends on how much value you're putting in there. Right. So if you're putting in your first $500 into Bitcoin, it doesn't really make sense to spend $200 on a hardware device to secure that. But if it's getting to be a significant chunk of change, then you probably want to spend the time and get a hardware device. And then the other thing that you touched on is sort of, waiting a year and Bitcoin being worth more or less. And there's no guarantee that Bitcoin is going to be worth more in a year than the equivalent dollars, because both dollars and Bitcoin are very volatile, and everything that we have in our lives is priced in dollars. And so the way that I usually put it is that Bitcoin is a good place to store money that you don't need soon. Okay. So if you need it, if you need it in 3 months, that's actually quite a big risk, because you're gambling on whether that price goes up or down. If you need it in a year, it's a bit less of a risk, but there's still some risk there, because the cycles that Bitcoin moves in tend to be a little bit longer than that. But like I mentioned earlier, there's never been a time when you couldn't put value into Bitcoin, wait 5 years, and be massively up.
I'm pulling up the long. I'm searching for a long-term graph for sure, because every time it goes down, it kind of maybe doesn't go down as far, and then it goes up a little. Like I can already picture what it's going to look like. I've looked at that chart before, but it has been an interesting journey when you look at over that period of time. Just give me a graph here, computer. Why are you being difficult? Graph. I'm going to blame the computer, but possibly it's my search query. History chart since 2009. When did Bitcoin first hit the scene? Was it 2009?
Yeah, it launched in 2009.
That's right. Oh yeah, it's interesting when you do look at it over that 2009 to 2018 was kind of the first bump, right? Where it took off, or kind of broke out of that flat line. And I'm looking at I'm looking at a 15-year chart.
If you zoom in, that flat line doesn't look as flat. Actually.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm looking too big right now. Yeah.
Yeah, because the change from $1 to $14 was a huge one, for example, and then the change from $30 to $180, another huge one. Like those spikes were actually much greater in terms of the relative change than the swings that we see today.
Yeah. Yeah, and percentage of one to 10 versus, and I remember when 100K was the ceiling, and now it's blown past that, and it's down to what, 90 something today or something. Basically,
Yeah.
we're talking. When you think about long term predictions, anyone I know who's bullish on it will, oh, it's going to go, it's going to go, it's going to go. But everyone I know who's been bullish on it has been right at some point in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's kind of proving out your point that kind of the idea is out of the barn, right? There's no putting the genie back in the bottle, to mix up my metaphors here.
Definitely.
Interesting. So for yourself, looking at the different businesses, obviously you made the comment about, legal businesses that are providing, is that your main focus kind of when you look at what, is maybe your mission or your purpose to make it accessible? Like you talk about the market, you talk about the rodeo, which sounds really interesting. I think I'm in town. I'm going to attend that actually. But it sounds like your mission, if I was to interpret it from the outside, is to really make it approachable. Like there's the Bitcoin geeks like you who've been in there, and I say that with huge affection since the beginning. And then there's all those people going, okay, there's something here. I'm not an early adopter, but this is way past early adopter territory. It feels like that approachability is the mission that I would say you flag. I hear you flying.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the space for quite a while professionally, and so I've been involved in a number of different companies. And the ones that I mentioned, Bull Bitcoin, I helped found in 2018, and sometime after there, Bull Bitcoin is a Bitcoin exchange, buys and sells Bitcoin. It's a pretty simple product. It's available in Canada, the U.S., Canada, Europe, and Mexico. Okay. And Bitcoin Well, the other one that I mentioned, is one that I joined a little while after that we took public. It's a company based in Edmonton. And Bitcoin Well is operating.
I've had the founder on the show. That was probably the last good Bitcoin conversation I had, which is probably 3 years. That conversation is getting a bit long in the tooth. That's why I was quick to have you on.
So Bitcoin Well is operating in Canada and the US, and both those companies buy and sell Bitcoin. So I'm still on the board at Bitcoin Well, but I've left my executive role there a couple of years ago. And since then, I've been mostly focused on this events and media startup that we've got going around the Bitcoin rodeo. And a lot of what we're trying to do, we've got a website that we're revamping. We've got a couple podcasts that we're running.
Oh, nice.
And some more that we're going to be launching here. What we're trying to do with those podcasts especially is sort of cross over into different communities that we feel are adjacent to Bitcoin. And so we've got one running right now called Unhypnotized, for example. A woman named Heather, who's really awesome. She's a hypnotherapist for many years and very into the sort of spiritual side of the world. And, we're trying to kind of cross over into that segment of people that
when you said crossover into adjunct industries, that was not the one I thought you might share.
Yeah. Well, the interesting
you caught me
thing
off guard with that one, Dave. I like it.
Yeah, that group of people who are into sort of the naturopathic healing, psychedelics, the expansion of the mind, all these different things.
Our reconnection to the natural world, I will boldly say.
Yeah, absolutely. They tend to have a little bit more independent thinking and a little bit more slant towards wanting personal freedoms. And so
and away from the institutionalized thinking. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. I wouldn't have aligned those, but now that I hear, and I know lots of people in that space, and you're right. They do not partake in the everyday narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're hoping to get some shows. Like we've got that one. We've got another one that's just about to launch called Driving Bitcoin, where we're going to be essentially borrowing all of our friends' fancy cars and wiring them up like Top Gear and driving around talking about Bitcoin. And so, with that one, we're obviously trying to
coffees and cars, Top Gear, bolt them all together. Yeah, fun.
Yeah, we're basically trying to get the car people with that one. And we're just, like you mentioned, we're just getting past the early adopter stage. I think we're just kind of at the end of the early adopter stage.
Okay.
We did a survey in 2022, I want to say, that matched actually the findings of the Bank of Canada pretty closely, that about 15% of Canadians have or do own Bitcoin. And so there's a huge number that are sort of the next big chunk. And we're right kind of, if you think about an S curve of adoption, I think we're kind of right at the bottom of the big spike. And that's sort of what we're banking on. That's what we're looking to reach out to, are these other communities of people who have, aligned and similar interests that, we can reach into their world, show them some content that they find interesting, and then tie it back to Bitcoin in a way that's relevant. And so we've got a couple different shows. We've got a sports-based one and sort of a travel tourism one that we're looking at too with that.
Interesting. So you're really taking the approach of, how do we meet people where they are, is what I'm kind of hearing you say.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what we're doing with the Bitcoin rodeo also. We're having it right in downtown Calgary, so we're in the heart of the oil industry. We're hoping to get a lot of oil and gas people, a lot of people from Calgary who are very freedom minded, and yeah, just have a meeting of minds.
Interesting. So yeah, again, you kind of asked to say who shows up at the Bitcoin rodeo. Like, am I? Is it workshops? Am I sitting? I'm listening to speakers. Is it keynotes? Is it your standard kind of conference format?
Yeah, it's mostly panels. We're going to be having a few little workshops that are kind of specific to learn a specific skill, but the bulk of it is panels, and we try to get a pretty broad spectrum of people. I think I like panels a lot more than keynotes for the most part, unless you have a really truly remarkable keynote
Unless
speaker.
you've got a pro at keynotes, a panel is safer. I've been in many conferences. I've moderated many panels. A good keynote will blow you away, but an average keynote is a waste of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be bold, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus for trying, but if you're going to do a keynote, like polish it up, like, be good at it.
Yeah,
if not,
definitely.
a panel is a much safer strategy. I agree with you.
Yeah, and so in the panel you get just like a lot more perspectives, and so.
Yeah.
We've got a pretty great speaker list. You can see them on the website again at bitcoinrodeo.com.
Nice, I'm gonna check it out.
We've got a bunch more coming out soon.
And when you look at that event, do you kind of get a read on how many of those have you hosted? How many in are you? Did you say 4? Did I hear you that earlier?
Yeah, this is the 4th one.
This is the 4th. Yeah, nice. Do you kind of look around the room and go, okay, there's the, there's my group, there's the gang I always see here, and then okay, here's some people that I've maybe seen once, and oh, here's a whole like 15%, or like these are people that are just like, when you feel like the FNG, the FNU guy, you're like, oh, where do I go? Where do I sit? What session do I go to? What's the balance look like? And I'm assuming you get a mixed bag in the room.
Yeah, it's probably about half people that I don't know. Okay. We get our community out. Obviously, we get all the vendors and whatnot that are at our SAT markets, and the local Bitcoin enthusiasts are pretty happy to come out to that. But there's and we're always trying to get more and more new people. So that I think is a pretty big push for us, and I think we've done better with that every year than the previous year. And I'd like to think that we create some new Bitcoiners every year. So the people who were new last year are back and not new.
Yeah, totally. Not you can be 2 years in and be a veteran in this space, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So if I look at, and this is a personal question, you can answer it any way you want. If you look at your own portfolio, are you all in with Bitcoin? Do you still balance it out and go, no, I'm still going to play in some of the traditional markets because I think there is still opportunities, and there are some good companies that might not even be in North America. They could be globally. Or are you like, no, I'm fully believe in this? And you can answer this any way you want. It's one of those questions right at the end.
So I have some startup investments. I have a little bit of public company stock from companies that I'm involved in.
Yeah.
But most of my money is in Bitcoin.
Okay.
And that's because of the pain that I've felt over the years where, I've sold entirely too many Bitcoin in my life. And I've seen
if I only could have to do what I know now. Yeah.
And I've seen the costs of those things. And this goes back to a pretty interesting fundamental change that I believe Bitcoin will bring to society. And that is kind of in our inherent way of short-term thinking nowadays, right? And that's something that's fueled by money printing. And like I mentioned earlier, if your money is going to be worth half as much tomorrow, you're highly incentivized to spend it immediately. We're not in such a bad scenario, but we're still in a spot where we're going to lose a lot of our cash if we don't spend it soon. And most big purchases are only going to go up in price. Right? If you need to buy a car, it's not going to be cheaper next year.
Oh, that's going up. Isn't that going up weekly right now? It's like picking on cars as an example. It's crazy how much. I get my coffee from a lady that I know who knows a roaster. She's like, hey, sorry, it's going up 30%. Like, these aren't little jumps there. So I'm like, oh, I'll stockpile and buy 10 bags of coffee. But that's a small hedge against the future of me still drinking coffee a year from now.
Yeah, exactly. And so what that incentivizes is for people to make choices that are the best for them in the short term. You buy the thing that you need now. You probably spend as little as possible on it because it's going to break also, and you're going to have to buy it again. And the difference with storing your money in Bitcoin is that you start to think, hey, if I don't buy this now and I just wait, this is going to be a lot cheaper in the future. And you start to see the things that you spent Bitcoin on in the past, and you look at these horrifying, shocking numbers of like, I spent 15 Bitcoin on a trinket in 2012, right? Like things that, you'd love to have those choices back. And it starts to
a
shift the way
$1.5
that
million
you,
trinket. Yeah, totally.
yeah, exactly. It starts to shift the way that you think about things, starts to shift your decision making, and you start to prioritize putting off instant gratification and putting more thought into your purchasing decisions. And then ultimately that leads you to the fact that, if I'm going to be parting with my very hard-earned Bitcoin that I believe will be worth more in the future, I better be doing that for a product that I know holds up to the ideals of Bitcoin. So I'm less likely.
That's really interesting. It's the ultimate. It's the marshmallow test, right? You want 2 marshmallows now, or wait 15 minutes and have 3 marshmallows later.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of mindset. And notoriously, a lot of people that failed that test, from what I've read, that study, 10 years from now or 15 years in the future, didn't do as well as the people that were able to resist the instant gratification. To your comment.
Yeah, exactly. It's a concept called time preference, which is where you discount your future results. Right. So if it was 2 marshmallows now or 3 marshmallows 10 years from now, a rational person takes the 2 marshmallows now, right? Because the difference in time is too great. But if it's 10 minutes, you just wait the 10 minutes. Right. Yeah. And so I think Bitcoin will bring about a shift in our thinking, and that the changes that will bring to society and the way that we make choices as consumers will be profound. And those will be felt throughout our society, because it'll incentivize businesses to create products that stand the test of time and that hold up to those kind of purchasing decisions.
Which is reverting back to maybe way things were done at a different time, not that long ago, when quality, craftsmanship, value, it wasn't about the instant gratification of I got the new thing. It's like, no, I bought the thing, it's great, and now I'm going to keep it for the next 20 years. And you run into products every once in a while, you're like, this is X amount of years old, and wow, they don't make them like that anymore. Like, those kind of comments are very prevalent. They get said in passing, but I think, like, to your point, it's representative of a bigger problem, which is consumerism, and I work in marketing, so I get it.
There's a couple books that really get into this that are, there's one called the Bitcoin Standard.
You mentioned it earlier in passing, the Bitcoin Standard.
The Bitcoin Standard is kind of like the Bible of Bitcoin. It gets into all the roots of what money is and the history of money. And there's another one by the same author that I actually like more, called the Fiat Standard. Okay. And the Fiat Standard gets into the history of fiat currency and all the impacts that it's had on our lives. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that the incentives for basically everything get twisted. And so when you earn $1, you're supposed to be able to spend the entire value of that dollar in your own best interests. But what's happening now instead is that when you earn $1, the government's printing $3. And so a huge percentage of the purchasing power that you were supposed to have with your money goes towards things that are not necessarily in your best interests, but are in fact in the best interests of the people who printed the money. And that disconnect has really, really had a profoundly negative impact on society, because nothing in the world is priced properly. Market forces have not been able to act on our food supply. Market forces have not been able to act on virtually any industry that we have out there, because, well, you're earning money, the government is printing even more money. And so bringing those incentives back in line is just what I was talking about with that delayed gratification, right? And so I think in the long term, we're going to see a world where, I think most people would agree the world's kind of insane right now. And a big part of that is
it's the general feeling of complete loss of control.
Yeah, a big part of that is because our incentive structures are completely broken, because our money is completely broken.
Interesting. The scary thing is what needs to happen between here and when anything looks different, because it's so invested in, like, the institutions are invested in protecting themselves, right? Like to your comment earlier, what needs to happen and how catastrophic it needs to be, or certainly significant to create a change in that flow. That's a real scary, go through the hard to get to the good kind of mindset.
Yeah, definitely. There's the saying that's like, hard men create good times create weak men.
Weak men create
the
hard
cycle.
Times. Yeah,
weak men create hard times. Hard times create hard men.
Yeah,
and we're just in the weak men create hard times part of that cycle right now, and we all have a little pain to go through, I think, before we get to the other side of that.
When you look at our political options, it's hard to deny that that's not a true statement Dave just made.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need better options. Dave, that was optimistic, realistic, and maybe a little bit people are like, that's kind of heavy. I need to think about that, which is exactly a successful episode of a podcast. If you walk away, go do a little bit of thinking, go check out Bitcoin Rodeo. I'm going to check that out. I'm in town, I think, so I'm going to come and check that out. I haven't I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and then I kind of spent less time there. So really talking to you today has kind of reawakened a lot of thoughts that I'd kind of parked for the last couple of years because I was busy thinking about other things. But I think this is certainly worth bringing to top of mind. And I appreciate your perspective and how you came at it from a broader, like, hey, let's look at the bigger picture and what role can this play and what role is it playing? That was really interesting. I appreciate your point of view, Dave.
Yeah, it was a great conversation.
Thanks, my friend. Hey, if people want to get a hold of you, obviously bitcoinrodeo.com. We've plugged the heck out of that, so go check it out. LinkedIn. What's your preferred form of smoke signal these days?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm one of the many Dave Bradleys on LinkedIn.
Okay, but only the strongest and best looking. Let's be clear.
Yeah, exactly. I'm Bitcoin Brains on most platforms. You can find me on Twitter. You can also check out my website, bitcoinbrains.com, and lots of important information on there.
I love it. Dave, thanks for the work you do, and thanks for having a position and not being scared to stand behind it. I like it. That makes for a very good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, my friend. Cheers.
Cheers.